She lost her sight the night the fire took her husband. But when a stranger's hammer echoed across her lonely land, she began to see more clearly than ever before. The land spread wide and dry around her cabin, the grass brittle underfoot, the sky a hard, endless blue. Miriam Cole woke before sunrise as she always did, feeling her way along the wall until her fingers brushed the wooden peg where her shawl hung. She counted softly as she crossed the room, 5 steps to the table, 3 more to the door, each movement learned by heart after the fire stole her eyes. Outside, the air carried the smell of dust and sage. She lifted her face toward the wind, listening for the soft rustle that told her which way it blew. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote cried, and the sound echoed through the emptiness like a memory. Miriam thought of her husband then, of the night the flames took him, of how she had screamed his name but heard only the crack of burning wood in answer. She could still feel the heat on her skin, the sting in her eyes before the darkness came. Yet she had not died, though some mornings she wished she had. She tied her hair back, took the bucket by the door, and walked the path to the well, counting every stone under her feet. The handle creaked as she lowered it, the rope rasping like a voice too long unused. When she drew the bucket up again, water sloshed cold against her hands, and she smiled faintly at the touch. It was something real, something left. Back at the porch, her cow bell lowed softly, and Miriam answered with a quiet hum. "I hear you, girl," she said, finding the worn wooden stool by feel. She milked slowly, her hands sure even without sight, each motion steady as breathing. The milk splashed into the tin pail, the sound as comforting as any prayer. By mid-morning, the sun warmed her shoulders. She moved along the rows of her small garden, touching leaves, feeling the edges of weeds. She could tell by the texture which plants needed pulling, which ones had taken root strong. When she found a new sprout, she whispered to it like it was a child. The neighbors thought her strange, the blind widow who talked to dirt and ghosts, but she didn't care. Words filled the air where sight could not. Now and then she paused to listen, to be sure the world still turned. She could hear the wind sweeping across the plain, the far rattle of a wagon on the road, the steady tick of her heart reminding her she was still here. Her hands bore scars from old burns, her skin pale from years spent mostly indoors, but there was strength in the way she stood, a quiet kind that doesn't ask to be noticed. When evening came, she lit the lamp though she could not see its glow, feeling the warmth instead. She ate bread and beans, whispered a prayer she could no longer remember fully, and sat by the open window, letting the night air brush her face. Somewhere out there, the world was moving, but for now, her acre was enough. The wind had gone still. By the time Miriam gathered the last bundle of dry sticks from the edge of the field, the hush settling over the land so deep she could hear her own breathing. The air smelled of iron and dust, the kind that came before rain but never gave it. She turned her face toward the faint sound of hooves, thinking at first it was a stray traveler on the road, but the rhythm slowed, stopped, and then came the sound that made her heart tighten, the heavy exhale of a horse, too near her fence. Miriam froze, the bundle slipping from her arms. She gripped her cane, every muscle straining to listen. A low voice came out of the twilight, rough and uneven, like a man unused to talking much. "Fence is falling by the north corner," he said, his words calm, not mocking. "You want me to fix it for you?" Miriam's mouth went dry. She turned her head toward the sound, seeing nothing but the shapes her mind had learned to build from sound alone. "Who are you?" she asked, and the question trembled more than she liked. "Name's Silas," he answered after a pause long enough to make her wonder if he'd gone. "Just passing through, saw the gap, thought I'd say something." His voice carried the roughness of distance, not meanness, and she heard in it the kind of weariness that comes from a man who's seen too many empty miles. Still, she kept her grip on the cane, ready to swing if she had to. "I can mend my own fence," she said quietly. "I believe you can," he replied, and she could almost hear him smiling, not out of pity, but something closer to respect. Then came the sound of boots on dirt, slow and careful, followed by the soft creak of wood as he tested a loose post. "You got good land," he murmured. "Shame to let it waste." The words stung more than they should have. She wanted to tell him the land was alive because she made it so, because she'd refused to leave it when everyone said she should, but something in his tone stopped her. It was not insult, only truth, spoken by a man who sounded like he knew about things breaking down. "Do what you want," she said finally, stepping back. "But I can't pay you." "Didn't ask for pay," he said, the sound of nails tapping against wood following his words. "Just figure I owe the world some mending." They didn't speak again for a while. Only the rhythm of hammering filled the dusk. Miriam listened, feeling a strange calm settle over her, the kind that comes when danger decides to rest instead of strike. When he finally stopped, he said, "Storm coming tomorrow. Tie your cow." She nodded, though he couldn't see it. The next moment he was gone, only the faint beat of hooves fading into the dark, leaving her standing by the fence, heart still caught between fear and something she couldn't name. The sky that evening was heavy, with the kind of light that turns gold into gray, the kind that makes a person feel the world holding its breath. Miriam stood on her porch, listening to the hammer strike wood in slow, steady rhythm. Each sound told her where Silas was, how he moved, how careful he was not to waste effort. He didn't speak, didn't hum, didn't whistle like other men did when they worked. Only the scrape of the hammer, the thud of boots in dirt, and the soft grunt when he lifted a beam broke the stillness between them. She could almost picture him, tall maybe, shoulders bent from years of labor or guilt, hands rough but not cruel. He worked as if the task mattered, though the fence wasn't his and the land never would be. She turned her face toward the sound, letting the rhythm mark the fading of day. When the hammering stopped, she heard him walk the line, testing each post with a push and a tug. The air smelled of rain far off, that faint iron scent that makes the heart ache with memory. She wondered if he felt it too. When she spoke, her voice came quiet, almost unsure. "You meant well for a man just passing through." There was a pause, then his low reply, "Ain't the first fence I've fixed." She wanted to ask more but didn't. Some silences feel safer unbroken. She moved to gather her bucket by the door, her cane tapping soft on the porch boards. Behind her, Silas's boots shifted in the dirt, the sound stopping close enough that she could feel his shadow, though she couldn't see it. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said after a while, his voice carrying something like respect under the roughness. "World's not kind to women by themselves." She tightened her grip on the bucket, chin lifting slightly. "The world's never been kind," she said, "but it's quieter this way." He gave a sound that might have been a laugh or maybe just breath leaving his chest. The wind rose, tugging at her skirt and stirring dust along the path. "Storm coming," he said, almost to himself, but she caught the note of concern in it. "Tie your animals and shutter your windows. These plains turn ugly fast." She nodded, though her throat tightened. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her with care instead of pity. She wanted to thank him, but the words felt too heavy to lift. When she turned again, the sound of his footsteps was already fading toward the gate. No goodbye, no promise to return, only that same tired calm. The hammer lay beside the fence post where he'd left it, handle still warm from his hand. Miriam bent to touch it, tracing the smooth, worn wood with her fingers. It was strange how a man could arrive out of nowhere, mend what was broken, and walk away like he'd done nothing at all. Rain began before nightfall, soft at first, then harder, until the roof groaned under it. Miriam lay awake listening to the water beat down, counting each leak by sound. There was a new one tonight, somewhere near the corner where the lamp hung. She placed a tin pail beneath the drip, the steady plink marking time long after she had blown out the flame. The wind whistled through the cracks in the boards, shaking the window panes until they clicked like teeth. She wrapped herself in a shawl, feeling the damp creep through the cabin. It smelled of smoke, wood, and loneliness. When she finally slept, it was shallow, filled with dreams of footsteps that weren't hers. By morning, the air hung heavy and cold. She woke to the faint smell of tobacco drifting through the cracks in the door, mixed with the sharp scent of wet leather. Her heart jumped once, not from fear exactly, but from the shock of knowing someone was near. She took up her cane and followed the smell through the mud to the barn. The rain had eased to a mist, the kind that clings to skin and breath. Inside, she heard it first, the scrape of a boot against a rafter, the hammer tapping wood. "Who's there?" she called, though she already knew. "Roof was worse than I thought," Silas said from above, his voice muffled but calm. "Didn't seem right to leave it." She stood in the doorway, hands gripping her cane so tight, her knuckles ached. "I told you I can't pay," she said, the words steadier than she felt. "Didn't ask for coin," he answered. The hammer paused. She heard him shift his weight, then cough once like a man unused to explaining himself. "You'd have drowned in here come next rain." For a while she said nothing, just listened to him work. Every strike of the hammer seemed to drive away a piece of the silence that had filled her house since her husband's death. The boards creaked as Silas moved along them, and she could tell by the rhythm that he knew what he was doing. Still, she couldn't shake the unease curling in her chest. People didn't do kindness without reason. Not out here. Not anymore. When the noise stopped, she heard him climb down, boots landing in the straw with a soft thud. "That ought to hold," he said quietly. "Least till summer." She turned her face toward the sound of his voice. "Why keep coming back?" she asked. He hesitated, and she heard the faint rasp of his breath before he said, "Guess I don't know where else to be." She wanted to believe that was the truth. Then she heard it, the faint tremor of his hand brushing his coat, the sound of a man who flinches even at his own movements. It was the sound of someone waiting for hurt that never came. Miriam lowered her cane, her voice softening. "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not," he said. "But maybe I need to." Morning came gray and slow, the kind that made even birds quiet. Miriam sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a tin cup, the coffee inside gone lukewarm. Across from her, Silas stared at the steam curling faintly in the chill air. He had come in before sunrise, silent as always, to check the patched roof and bring in dry wood. She had offered him coffee because it felt wrong not to. Now they sat facing each other in a room filled with the smell of smoke and damp wool, saying nothing for longer than most people could stand. Finally, Silas cleared his throat, a rough sound like gravel under boots. "You ever hear of the Riker gang?" he asked. Miriam turned her head slightly toward him, her blind eyes catching the faint light. "I heard plenty about men like them," she said. "Robbers, killers, the kind folks pray pass them by." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I rode with them once," he said quietly, the words landing heavy in the air. "Wasn't proud then. Sure ain't now." She didn't speak right away, only sipped her coffee, the cup trembling faintly in her hands. He went on, voice low and even. "Didn't have much choice back then. You ride or you starve. I was younger, meaner maybe, but I never killed, not once. Didn't have it in me." The chair creaked as he shifted, waiting for the judgment he was used to. Miriam only tilted her head, listening for something in his tone, something she couldn't name. "I can't see your sins," she said softly, setting the cup down. "Only here if they still own you." The words hung between them like smoke after a fire, twisting slow and quiet. Silas looked at her, trying to read her face, but she gave nothing away. Her eyes, pale and unfocused, held no fear, no disgust, just calm, like the steady wind across the plains. "You talk like a preacher," he muttered, half smiling. "I've heard enough sermons to know the difference between talk and truth," she said. "If you were proud of it, you'd have lied instead of confessing. Let's durate. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the worn floorboards. You don't know what kind of man I was. No, she said, her voice steady. But I hear what kind you're trying to be. The fire popped in the stove, filling the silence that followed. Outside, wind brushed the eaves, carrying the scent of wet earth. Silas finished his coffee and stood, his shadow shifting across the floor. Guess I'll fix that gate now, he said, almost shy. She nodded, hands folding in her lap. You don't have to prove anything, she said quietly. He hesitated by the door, his voice barely more than a whisper. Maybe not to you. Then he stepped outside, the screen creaking shut behind him, leaving Miriam alone with the soft sound of rain and the echo of a man's name he no longer wanted to carry. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned, the kind that slips in quiet and stays without asking. Silas rose early to mend what time had worn thin, his boots scuffing softly across the porch boards, his hammer steady and sure. Miriam learned to follow the sound of his work, the low hum he made under his breath when he was thinking, the scrape of wood against wood as he fitted each nail. She still kept her cane near, but more often than not she left it leaning against the wall. His voice became her compass. When he spoke, she turned toward him without fear, trusting the direction of sound more than sight. He described things for her as he worked, not because she asked, but because it felt right to fill the silence. He told her how the clouds rolled like smoke over the hills, how the wheat caught sunlight and burned gold in the wind, how the sky at dusk turned red enough to make a man think of sin and forgiveness all at once. She listened like the land itself was speaking through him. In her mind, she painted what she could not see, the words shaping color and distance where there had been only darkness. Sometimes he caught her smiling, head tilted as if she could see again, and he felt something shift inside him, something that scared him more than any lawman ever had. In return, she told him small stories of her husband, how he had been kind once before, whiskey hollowed him out, how the fire that took him also freed her from the shouting that used to fill these walls. Silas didn't answer much, just grunted softly or nodded, but she could hear understanding in the way his breath changed, slow and deep, like a man listening to his own past through hers. When evening came, they sat on the porch together. She could tell where he was by the smell of tobacco and the faint creak of the chair when he shifted his weight. Sometimes he would describe the sunset, and though she couldn't picture it exactly, she could feel the warmth in his words. Their silences stopped being heavy. They were simply there, breathing the same air, letting the wind speak for them. Still, there was a shadow in Silas he couldn't hide. She could sense it when his tone grew distant, or when the sound of his boots faded down the path for hours at a time. The law, she guessed, didn't forget names like his. Once, she heard him stop mid-sentence, the word dying in his throat, as if he'd remembered something too painful to share. That night, as rain whispered against the roof, Miriam said softly, "You can't outrun what you were, but you can walk beside what you are." He didn't answer, only sat still long enough that she knew he'd heard. In the dark, her sightless eyes turned toward him, and for the first time, he felt seen. The wind carried news faster than any rider, whispers rolling from town to town like tumbleweed, and by the time it reached Miriam's porch, the story had changed shape a dozen times. A U.S. Marshal was coming through, they said, hunting the last of the Riker gang, cleaning up what the hangman had missed. When Silas heard, he went quiet. The hammer he held stilled mid-swing, the nail half driven into the board. Miriam couldn't see his face, but she heard the way his breath caught and stayed caught, the way the space between one word and the next stretched longer than before. That night, his boots did not rest by the door. She heard them pacing, back and forth, from one end of the porch to the other, the boards creaking in rhythm with a man who had forgotten how to stand still. By morning, he was gone before sunrise, leaving the faint scent of tobacco and rain, damp leather behind. Miriam sat by the stove, her hands tracing the rim of her cup, knowing, without knowing, that he wasn't just out fixing fences. The air in the cabin felt heavier when he wasn't in it, as if silence itself missed him. When he returned by dusk, his steps were slow, his voice low when he said, "Marshall's close. Maybe a day, maybe less." She nodded, heart steady though her stomach turned cold. "Will he find what he's looking for?" she asked. Silas laughed once, short and without humor. "Men like that always do." For the next 2 days, the world seemed to shrink. Every sound carried meaning. A horse, neighing far off, made Silas flinch. The clap of thunder had him reaching for a gun she hadn't known he still kept. He moved like a man waiting for a reckoning, fixing small things that didn't need fixing, sharpening tools already sharp. Miriam listened and learned the shape of his fear by the rhythm of his work. It was in the pauses, in the times he started to speak and didn't finish, in how he stood longer at the window even though he knew she couldn't see. That evening, when the sky dimmed to copper, she spoke quietly from her chair. "You keep pacing like a man who's already been caught," she said. "Are you running from something, or toward it?" The question hung in the room like the weight of thunder before rain. He turned away, but she heard the sigh that came from somewhere deep. "Don't reckon I know anymore," he said. "Been running so long I forgot where it started." Outside, a lone rider's silhouette crossed the ridge, faint against the last light. Miriam could hear the distant hoofbeats, slow but certain. She rose and found the edge of the table, her fingers steady. "You don't have to hide here," she said softly. "But you don't have to run alone either." Silas stood silent for a long time, his shadow stretching toward her. "I'll think on that," he said, though they both knew he already had. The first sign of it came on the wind, that sharp dry scent of smoke that crawled low across the plains. Miriam stood on the porch, head tilted, listening to the strange crackle beneath the breeze. When the wind shifted, she caught it full in her nose and knew what it was. Fire. Somewhere close. She reached for the cane by the door and stepped into the yard, her bare feet finding dust instead of grass. The world felt hotter, the air tight as cloth pulled too close to the skin. From far off came the faint roar of burning brush, a sound like a beast breathing through its teeth. She turned toward it, calm but firm. She would not run. This land, rough and stubborn, was all she had left. Silas came pounding down the slope a few minutes later, voice hoarse with panic. "Miriam, get your things. We have to go." She shook her head. "I won't leave. The barn, the house, it's all I've got." He cursed under his breath, the kind of words meant for no one to hear. "You stay, you die." She lifted her chin. "Then I stay." The fire reached the ridge before nightfall, orange light cutting through the smoke like veins of gold. Silas tied his shirt over her mouth, took her by the arm, and dragged her toward the creek while she fought him with words more than strength. "Put me down," she said, but her voice broke when the air turned to ash. He lifted her without effort, coughing hard as sparks rained around them. His boots sank into mud by the creek's edge, the water black with soot. He set her down in the shallows and fell beside her, chest heaving, smoke curling from his hair. For a long time neither spoke. Only the sound of the fire raging above them filled the dark. When dawn came, the world smelled of wet earth and ruin. The ridge was a skeleton against the pale sky, the barn half collapsed, the field gone to ash. Miriam stirred, her fingers brushing his sleeve. "You still here?" she asked softly. He let out a rough laugh that turned into a cough. "Couldn't very well leave you," he said. She reached out again, found his hand, and froze at the raw heat of it. The skin was burned, the blisters raised. "You fool," she whispered, holding it gently between hers. "You saved what matters." He looked at her then, though she could not see it. His throat tightened. "You mean yourself?" She shook her head slowly, the faintest smile touching her mouth. "No, Silas, I mean you." For a long time, neither spoke. The fire on the ridge hissed itself out, leaving only the sound of water and wind. He sat there beside her, his burned hand resting in her lap, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, something clean and dangerous. It was the ache of being cared for, and it scared him more than the fire ever could. The sound of hooves came first, slow and deliberate, each strike against the dry earth carrying the weight of authority. Miriam stood by the porch rail, her hand resting on the worn wood, listening as the horse drew near. She could smell the metal of a badge before she heard the voice, sharp and official, calling out for anyone home. "Name's Marshal Dugan," the man said. "I'm looking for a fellow goes by Silas Reed. Heard he's been seen in these parts." The air seemed to thin around her, but she didn't flinch. She straightened, her blind eyes fixed toward the sound, her voice calm as still water. "Ain't no man here but me and the wind," she said, "and she don't answer to anyone." The marshal laughed under his breath, not unkindly but without trust. "Strange. A widow alone this far out. You sure you haven't had any visitors?" Miriam tilted her head, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Visitors don't stay long. The land keeps most folk away." Behind the barn, Silas crouched low, every muscle tight, the butt of his revolver slick with sweat. He could hear each word, every breath she took. One wrong note, and she'd be lost with him. The marshal shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking. "If you do see him," he said, "best tell me. The man's dangerous." Miriam's hand tightened on the rail, the knuckles pale. "Danger comes in many shapes, Marshal. Sometimes it wears a star." There was silence then, long enough that she wondered if he'd draw on her just for saying it. But after a moment he spat in the dirt and said, "You've got grit, ma'am. Keep your door locked." The horse turned, hooves thudding away until they faded into the wind. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding. Silas stepped out from behind the barn, face pale under the soot, still marking his jaw. "You're a damn fool," he said, voice low but shaking. "You could have been shot for lying to him." She turned toward his voice, her eyes blank yet steady. "I've been shot at before," she said. "Didn't stop me breathing then, either." He took a step closer, anger and fear tangled in his chest. "You don't understand. They hang people for less." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I'm not done believing in what I can't see." The words caught him off guard, soft but sharper than any blade. He looked at her, really looked, at the calm lines of her face, the soot still on her skin from the fire, the unshaken strength of a woman who refused to bow. For a long time neither spoke. The wind moved through the ruined field, carrying the smell of smoke and earth. Finally Silas said quietly, "You should have let me go." She shook her head. "The world takes enough. It won't take kindness too." He turned away, throat tight, knowing he owed her more than his life, and fearing he'd never be able to repay it. The night before he left, the air felt too still, too full of things unspoken. Silas sat by the dying fire, watching the last coals pulse red, the sound of the wind brushing against the windows like a warning. He had packed what little he owned, his revolver, his bedroll, a small pouch of coins, and the wooden comb she had once dropped by accident and never bothered to find. He turned it over in his hand until dawn began to creep over the plains. The world outside was gray, the kind of gray that sits between endings and beginnings. He rose without noise and went to the barn, his boots soft in the dust. The horse shifted under his touch, as if it already knew. He saddled it slow, every motion a reason to delay what he had already decided. He didn't hear her come until the boards of the porch gave a faint groan. Her voice reached him through the half, light, low but steady. "You came to fix fences," she said, "but it was me that mended." He froze, his hand still on the strap. He wanted to answer, to tell her she was wrong, that he'd broken more than he ever fixed, but no words came. He turned toward her instead, and for a long breath they just stood there, the silence between them soft as dawn. Her hair hung loose down her back, brushed by the first hint of morning wind. The sun lifted slow behind her, and though she couldn't see it, she raised her face as if she could feel the color blooming in the sky. "You can't stay," he said finally, his voice rough. "The law will come again. They always do." She stepped down from the porch, her bare feet brushing the cold dirt. "Maybe they will," she said, "but I won't run. Not from ghosts, and not from you." Her hand found his sleeve, fingers light but certain. "You think leaving keeps me safe, but it just leaves me empty." He wanted to believe her, wanted to stay, but he could already hear the echo of hoofbeats that lived inside his mind, the sound of men who didn't forgive. "You don't understand," he said. "Everything I touch burns." She smiled then, faint but sure. "Fire doesn't only destroy. Sometimes it clears the ground for new things to grow." The horse shifted, impatient. He looked down, pretending to check the saddle, but really to hide the tremor in his jaw. "You deserve peace, Miriam," he whispered. "Not a man like me." She reached for him again, her touch finding his face this time, her fingertips tracing the scar at his temple. "Peace isn't what I wanted," she said softly. "It's light, and you brought it back." He couldn't breathe for a moment, couldn't trust himself to speak. The sun broke clean over the ridge then, washing her in gold. She stood still, eyes closed, her face lifted to the warmth like someone who finally saw without needing to see at all. The wind carried the sound before the echo reached the hills, a hollow crack that rolled through the valley like thunder. Miriam straightened from the garden, her hands covered in soil, heart pounding, though she told herself it was only distant hunters. But deep inside she knew the sound of a rifle when she heard it. The morning had begun quiet, the sky pale with the promise of heat, and Silas had already been gone 2 days. He had said little when he left, only that he had to settle something. His voice calm but final. She hadn't tried to stop him. A man like him couldn't live looking over his shoulder forever. Still, she found herself listening now to every shift of the wind, every echo of the plains, waiting for the silence that comes after gunfire. She went about her chores the way she always did, her body moving through the memory of each task. She drew water from the well, fed the cow, mended a tear in the porch curtain. Each small sound was a prayer she couldn't name. Now and then she caught herself turning toward the ridge, her blind eyes lifted, trying to sense if the world had changed. It felt wrong, how the air held its breath, how even the birds seemed to stay quiet. Down in the valley, Silas rode straight into the circle of men who once called him brother. The Riker gang had shrunk to 4, faces older, meaner, their laughter sharp as broken glass. He raised his hands before they could draw, saying only, "It ends here." They laughed first, thinking him weak, until the first shot came from his pistol, and one fell. The rest fired wild, the sound tearing across the dry basin. Dust rose like smoke. When it cleared, 2 lay dead, one ran limping into the scrub, and Silas stood bleeding, his shoulder dark with blood, but his eyes steady. The marshal's men came soon after, drawn by the gunfire. He dropped his weapon, ready for the chains, but the marshal only looked at him long and said, "Guess you saved me the trouble." Spratched into the felve. By the time word reached the ridge, the day had turned to dusk. Miriam sat on the porch, listening to the crickets waking in the brush. A rider's steps came slow along the path, uneven, tired. Her breath caught as the horse stopped near the fence. "You're late," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to betray her. Silas dismounted with effort, boots heavy on the ground. "Had to make sure the ghosts stayed buried," he said, half, smiling though she couldn't see it. She reached out, and he took her hand, rough palm against soft fingers. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You came back." He nodded, too weary for words. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and gunpowder, washing the valley clean. Miriam turned her face toward it, her hand still in his, and for the first time in days, she let herself breathe again. Spring came shyly that year, soft rain falling where fire had once burned the ridge bare. The earth drank deep, and the first shoots of green pushed through the black soil like quiet forgiveness. Miriam woke each morning to the smell of wet grass and the sound of birds building new nests under her eaves. The cabin still leaned where the fire and wind had taken their toll, but it stood, and so did she. Every step through her small garden reminded her that the world could heal if given time. Yet no matter how many mornings passed, her ears stayed turned toward the road, waiting for hoofbeats she told herself she no longer expected. When they finally came, they were slow and uneven, a tired rhythm that spoke of distance and pain. Miriam set down the tin she was filling with water and listened. The sound grew clearer, then stopped at the fence. Her heart climbed into her throat, and though she could not see, she felt the air change, warm with a presence she had not felt in weeks. The horse snorted softly, and a voice, rough but gentle, said her name, Miriam. She stepped forward, hands trembling, finding her way along the porch rail. "You're hurt," she said, hearing the strain in his breath. "Not bad," he lied, though the limp in his steps gave him away. She reached out, fingers brushing the worn fabric of his coat until she found his face. Her hands mapped the lines and hollows, the roughness of new scars. "The marshal?" she asked, voice low. He let out a weary sigh. He said a man who saves more than he's stolen might deserve one more chance. Her fingers paused at his jaw, the stubble coarse beneath her touch. "Then you're free," she said softly. He hesitated, as if unsure how to accept the word. "Guess so," he murmured. "Don't feel like it yet," she smiled faintly. "Freedom's not something you feel. It's something you grow into." They stood there a long while, the world around them hushed, except for the steady drip of water from the eaves. She kept her hand on his cheek, her thumb tracing the scar beneath his eye. "I told you," she whispered. "I see you fine." His throat tightened, and for once he had no words to give back. When the sun broke through the clouds, light spilled over the ridge, glinting off the wet leaves and the curve of the creek below. Miriam turned her face toward it, her blind eyes shining with the reflection she could not see. Silas watched her, understanding at last that sight had never been what made her strong. She had lived by sound, by touch, by faith, by the quiet courage that comes from seeing deeper than the surface. He took her hand, and together they stood at the edge of the field, the scorched land now green beneath their feet, two souls who had lost everything and somehow found each other in the dark. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.